Good morning, everyone. How are you guys doing?
Good.
Quinn, did you and Kiara get lizards yesterday?
No, we didn't.
Oh no!
We
Where
got
did you
a
guys
we got a picture of the turtle, but we went out to Blue River Glades and just had a hard time finding the spot. And
Yeah, we stopped once and we thought we found it, and then yeah, we searched for like another 15 minutes. We couldn't
Oh,
find
you had
it.
trouble finding the spot.
Yeah.
Okay. So you went past the golf course?
No, we couldn't find the golf course either. We tried to look it up on Google Maps, and we went to a golf course that we thought it was. Definitely wasn't it. And so then yeah, we just.
Okay. All right. That's unfortunate. Let's see. I can. Fortunately, I don't know road names. I'll locate it. So you have the GPS coordinates because the GPS coordinates are in the file that is on Moodle for how to submit your collection, sample herptile collection format. Let me go and open it up. So do you guys, either of you have a GPS in your car?
yeah, we tried to put in the coordinates, and we still were having troubles finding
Okay.
it.
Oh, so you did try putting coordinates in. So let me see. I'm pretty sure. Oh yeah. So the collected specimen part of the thing is Terrapini ornata, and I've put the coordinates in for Blue River Glade. So let me. Did you guys get the camera to Zach? Zach had asked if he could use the camera over the weekend. Also, did he contact you guys?
No, but I can drop it off today.
Okay. All right. Let me share my screen. All right. Can you guys see a big mountain? The stupid Catalina screensaver. Yes, no.
Yes.
Okay. I'm a heavy user of Google Earth. Can you guys see Google Earth?
Yeah.
Okay. So if you head down 435, you'll come to Gregory Avenue. So I'm going to zoom in right here. This is Gregory Avenue, Gregory Boulevard. So go west on Gregory Boulevard. You'll get to that Lake of the Woods that you go around. When you go around Lake of the Woods, you want to come down Oldham Road. So you want to go left at this little triangle. So go around the lake. When you get to the first triangle, you want to go left. And then at the next triangle, you want to go right. And then at that point, you're on Blue River Road. Right after you get on Blue River Road, you're going to pass the country club. Keep going past the country club. You'll get into forest, and you'll get to a point where the river is pretty close to the road. If you've gotten to there, you've gone too far. So after you pass the country club, you're looking for an opening to the left-hand side of the road. There's actually a little stream there, and that's where the parking area is. And what I do for safety generally is I go down past that, and there is a place where you can turn around, and then I come back to it so that you're on the correct side of the road. At that little turnout, you can see that there's a car sitting on the right-hand side of the road at that turnout. There's a better parking area on the left-hand side of the road as you're coming from the golf course. There's actually a sign set back a little ways into the forest that says that you're at Blue River Glade, and then you just take the trail up to Blue River Glade, and then the glade is right here, and you can see the hiking trail going through the glade. So 435 to Gregory to Oldham to Blue River Road. Take Blue River Road past the golf course, and then start looking for Blue River Glades on your left as you go south on Blue River Road. And the reason that the coordinates might not have worked for you is because the coordinates that I had are for up on the glade rather than on the road right next to it. But they should get you pretty close. Does that make more sense?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, yeah. That's the problem with going someplace where somebody else is doing the driving. You can't necessarily find your way back. When I go bicycling with people, they're like, I can't remember how to get to this one route. And I'm like, why? You've ridden that route like 10 times. And they're like, yeah, but I'm always following somebody else. And so I don't pay attention to the landmarks and stuff because I'm just following the wheel in front of me. So anyway, yeah, I wish I had known that. You could have called me and I probably could have directed you to where it was. I just didn't realize. Whenever you're out in the field like that, always feel free to call me and say, we're lost. Can you help us find where we're going? I got a phone call once from a student in Puerto Rico who had gotten lost in a thing called the big grid. It's a big rectangular grid that is marked off in 5-meter intervals. So every 5 meters there's a post. So it's a big 16-hectare grid, and it's all gridded off. And at each of these corner points, there's a post with a marking on it indicating where you are in the grid. And there's a trail that kind of snakes through this thing, and it branches off in a couple of different directions inside the grid. Anyway, she was lost somewhere in here, and was unfamiliar enough with the grid system to be able to navigate using the grid markers because she didn't work on the grid. And I asked her for what her grid coordinates were, and I was able to tell her what direction to walk because she had a compass at the time. And I was able to navigate her out of the grid without too much difficulty. So yeah, if you get into the field and you have any sort of trouble, feel free to call me. I think you guys all have my number, don't you? Did I give you that earlier in this semester? Well, I know Kiara has it from past research. So.
Yeah, I have it.
Okay, yeah. All right, so are you guys gonna go back and give that a shot again?
I will, yes.
Okay, all right. All right. Kiara has led discussion in the past, and Kelsey has led discussion in the past. That's correct?
No, it was Elizabeth Quinn.
It was Elizabeth. Why? And I have her listed up there. Why did I just ignore that note? So I guess my question now is, do you want me to draw the last remaining name from the hat, or does somebody want to volunteer? Somebody other than Kiara and Elizabeth? That sounds like a dearth of volunteers. I think I got rid of my hat, so let me make some labels here for a minute. The last remaining names. Oh wait, I didn't get rid of the old names at all. Haha. Who do I have? Rose. Take it away.
Oh, yay.
Oh yay! your parting gift, Rose, on the last day of classes.
Yeah, happy last day of class.
Yeah. Do it.
Okay, so their overall question, I guess we'll just start with that.
Sure.
So they wanted to figure out if climate change factors were causing a decline in the rate of amphibians in North America. And so they started out by figuring out factors that could affect their decline. So they looked at things that affect their life cycle. And those were winter intensity, snowfall, water availability during breeding, so places to lay their eggs, soil moisture during the summertime, and max summer temperature.
So an excellent way of leading discussion is to force your classmates to tell you those things by asking them about it. That way you don't have to carry the bulk of the knowledge transfer, plus it'll get them more involved in it.
Okay.
Yeah, actually your role entirely today could actually just be asking questions of your peers about the paper.
Okay, so I'm just going to go through the order of the papers. So
Yeah,
I
sure.
kind of summarized their introduction, just what they were looking for, what they were looking for in their data collection. And so, does anyone want to tell me how climate variability affects the occupancy dynamics? That little, like, just summarize that little section of the paper.
So you might start with when the authors mention occupancy. So they talk about two things here, right? They talk about well, they really talk about colonization and persistence are kind of the two things that they're thinking about. Occupancy is part of that. So you might ask, what is occupancy and how does that relate to colonization and persistence? So first, what is occupancy?
Like species living in an area.
Yeah, so these people went out and did a survey, and they basically surveyed an area and said, is species X here or not? Now, how does occupancy then relate to colonization and persistence?
How I understood it was that, like, if the species were there, which was the occupancy, then like the colonization, I guess, would be like if they stayed there and breed and reproduce and colonize, and then persistence was like year after year if they remained in that spot, since they went back each year to see if that same species was still there and like like how much of the population was still there.
Yeah, that's not a bad way of stating it. So imagine that you're at site A and you're at time period 3, and while you're there, you see Lithobates catespianus, which is a bullfrog. Now, Lithobates catespianus is a bullfrog, so it's there, so its occupancy is an occupancy of 1. It's there, as opposed to an occupancy of 0, meaning that it's not there. But it could be there because it was also there at site A at time 2, in which case it has persisted in that particular site from one time period to another. So that's what persistence is. In this same situation, you might have site B time 2. And at site A, you didn't see Lithobates catespianus at time A, so it would have an occupancy of 0. But it appears at site A time 3, which then implies that what has happened? Between time 2 and time 3.
Lithobates ended up being at site A.
And where did it come from? If it wasn't there before, it had to come from
A different site.
yeah, someplace else. Now, it might be site B, or it might be some other place that they're not measuring. But basically, the fact of the matter is it came from someplace else and arrived there. This would represent colonization. So one's occupancy at any particular time period is either due to it persisting at that site from previous time periods, or it having not been at that site in previous time periods and colonizing from some other site. And it might be a site that they were studying, although these sites are all far enough apart. It's probably not from a site that they're studying. It's just they've arrived at wherever they are studying and monitoring these things. It arrived from someplace else, wherever someplace else might have been. So when they talk about occupancy, they're talking about, is it there? But is it there has nothing to do with how it got there. Persistence and colonization have to do with why they found it at that place at that time. It's either persisting because it was there before and it continues to be there, or it has arrived there through colonization if it arrived at a place where it hadn't been in the past. And so anytime you see an animal at any point on the face of the earth, it's either a resident species that's been there for a long period of time and has been persisting there for a long period of time, or it's a relatively new introduction that has arrived there through some colonization event. And those two things, those two processes, determine the suite of species that occur at any particular site. And that's actually what they're interested in. You know, what are the suites of species at these different sites? How does that suite of species change over time? And is that change a directional change, meaning there are fewer species or more species over time? And then does that change have anything to do with climate change? So that's kind of the mindset that they're going into this with. And that's kind of in the first little section of the results data collection part. Is that kind of what you were getting at, Rose?
Yeah.
Yeah. Can you go back to the things that you listed before? So Rose, you talked about winter severity, snowfall, breeding water availability, summer soil moisture, and maximum temperature. Another excellent question for the class as a whole would be, why do you think those are the things that these people concentrated on? Like what's, in your mind, knowing everything that you know about amphibians at this point, why is winter severity, snowfall, breeding water availability, summer soil moisture, maximum temperature, why are those the kinds of things that these people concentrated on as they were doing this work?
Do you want me to answer this, or?
No, I want the class to answer it.
Well, amphibians need water available to reproduce. They lay their eggs in water, so that's an important factor. The moisture, amphibians have high water loss due to the permeability of their skin, and so that's also important. And then winters would be like if they freeze to death, then they're not going to keep surviving or reproducing. And then these were also like easy-ish variables to like measure and keep track of. So it's not like something super complex that would be difficult to record and maintain. And there were observations of these things for long periods of time.
Really long periods of time, unusually long periods of time for ecological data. The winter thing is intriguing to me, both partly because of what they found, but then also thinking about it. Tell me a little bit more, anybody, Kelsey or anyone else, how do you think winter might affect amphibians? Kelsey mentioned if winters are too severe, they might freeze. But of course, a lot of these things go under logs and underground and stuff during the winter. What might be a consequence of a too mild of a winter?
They wouldn't be able, they would not be able to conserve their energy the same, and it would cause them to have to do more hunting and expend their energy when they wouldn't normally have to.
Yeah, so if you have a mild winter, it might prompt them to come out of winter dormancy earlier. If they come out of winter dormancy too early because of temperatures, but their prey availability, the prey items that they would normally eat are not there yet, they may actually spend a period of time where they're active and they're at, active operating temperatures, operative temperatures, but they're active and they're not able to feed because the organisms that they rely on for prey are not present yet, because those organisms happen to be lagging behind the change in climate. And so a mild winter could actually be just as difficult for amphibians as an overly cold winter, because it takes them out of sync. It makes them active for a longer period of time, and potentially at a time of year when they can't get prey. So they're hanging out, they're active, but nothing to eat. So I'm sitting out here in the warm weather metabolizing and not bringing in any energy. So winter, all of these variables are more complicated to think about than they are at first glance if you begin to think about, just something as simple as, freezing to death. That's easy to think why that would have a negative effect. But then on the other extreme, what's the consequence of it being nice out? And we think of it being nice out as, woo, we get to go out and enjoy the outdoors. A frog may be thinking, oh my gosh, I'm out here and there's nothing to eat and I'm starving to death. So it's a nuanced sort of way of thinking about each of these variables. So maximum temperature, that's easy to see. Breeding water availability, that's easy to see. Soil moisture. Kelsey, did you comment about soil moisture, and does anyone want to comment about soil moisture?
I just said about how amphibians have high.
Okay, so that's covered in that. Okay, cool. All right, continue, Rose.
Okay, so does anyone just want to go over some of the factors that affected the places they were looking at? The northern forest, southern forest, and the western dry and the western montane.
So where are you at in the paper, Rose? Where are you thinking of?
Page 3 under how does climate variability affect occupancy dynamics?
That's why I thought you were.
So I'll just start with one of the results. They found in the northeastern forest communities that like after warmer summers and high soil moisture, there was an increase in amphibian populations, like increase in colonization and persistence.
So that kind of goes along with what you would think of ectotherms like warm weather and amphibians like wet weather. So that's not surprising. Then they go on to share some less obvious things, right? Somebody else.
I thought it was interesting how the soil moisture had the greatest positive effect on colonization and persistence in species with larger bodies.
Okay, did they provide any explanation as to why that might be the case?
Well, they were talking about life history and how it wasn't going to be a strong predictor of climate variation. But they wanted to state that one exception was that soil moisture had a greater positive effect. But they didn't give any explanation as to why.
So think about the animals that you have seen in lab and that we've talked about in class. When you think about large-bodied salamanders and large-bodied frogs and toads, which groups of organisms would you put in that category? And I'm not talking about like gigantic size, but just within kind of the normal range. Don't think about hellbenders at this point. Think about terrestrial organisms. Among the salamanders, what are the larger bodied salamanders that you're familiar with? And they do talk about this some later on when they talk about taxonomic specific trends. But you might, as you were reading the taxonomy, you might not have been translating that taxonomy into body size.
I remember from lab, I thought plesidons were larger, and then frogs, like Lithobates catabanus is a larger body size frog.
Okay, so bullfrog is a very big bullfrog. But among the frogs, just generally, you have little bitty frogs like Acorus and Pseudacorus, which we saw Acorus yesterday. That's a tiny frog. Pseudacorus isn't much bigger. But then you have toads, Bufo, and you also have spadefoot toads in the genus Spea. Those are bigger frogs. Among the salamanders, actually, plethodonids, in my mind, are kind of on the small side. What's the biggest salamander you guys saw in lab? It's actually the biggest salamander in this area. Do you guys recall the biggest salamander that you saw in lab?
I don't.
Anybody else?
Nope.
There was a whole jar of them.
There was a whole jar of a lot of things.
Well, that's true. There was a big jar with a lot of these in it.
It was one of the Ambystoma species, like Ambystoma maculatum or tigrinum.
Tigrinum, yeah, because we don't have a specimen of maculatum in the lab. So yeah, Ambystoma tigrinum or Mavortium, either of those, that's a decent size. That's a pretty good size salamander, especially compared to these little thin-bodied plethodonid species. And of course, where do they live? What is the family of the Ambystoma, Ambystomatidae? What's their common name? Because of what they do a large portion of the year.
The mole salamanders.
They're the mole salamanders because they do what?
They like dig in soil and they're underground.
They're underground. Toads bury themselves in the ground. Spadefoot toads bury themselves in the ground. The organisms that tend to bury themselves in the ground during part of the year, at least in North America, often also happen to be these larger bodied organisms. So when you think about the behavior and ecology of the organism, it then begins to make a little more sense why there would be this importance of soil moisture for the larger bodied organisms, because mole salamanders tend to be the larger salamanders in North America. Toads and spadefoot toads tend to be among the larger frogs in North America. And those are all species that happen to be organisms that burrow for a certain part of their lifespan. Certain plethodonid salamanders like Gyronophilus and Pseudotriton are kind of on the bulky, heavy side, but they are not as affected by soil moisture levels because they are found in seeps. They're found in these high elevation, small trickles of running water, and so they're not burying themselves in the soil during the inactive periods of the year. So even though they are large bodied, they happen to not be as affected by soil moisture. So don't forget what you know about the taxonomy of these organisms that you study in lab as you're reading the paper, because then things begin to make a little more sense when you can relate it to actual organisms that you've seen. Continue, Rose, with what are some of the, guide them through some of the what I found were more surprising findings.
Mm, I thought it was surprising that increased snowfall had the most negative effect in colder areas because it's already cold. So why does it matter if they get more snow?
It might. Did they give you any reason during the paper for explaining this?
No.
They didn't. So it may just be that, so as I was reading it, I was trying to think through what the possible reasons for these different findings might be. It may just be that in those years where they get more snowfall, they just happen to be, especially cold years. And so just like in the last paper that we were looking at, the Buckley and Huey paper, incidences of extremes are always going to be stressful for organisms. And so if increased snowfall is also indicative of generally colder temperatures during that year, that might lead to a decrease in persistence. What did y'all think of greater water having a negative effect on colonization and persistence in southeastern forests? So you give amphibians more water in the southeastern United States, and that has a negative effect, whereas giving amphibians in the Northeast United States more water, and that's better for them.
Didn't they say it was because the like amount of water, even though it was more water, it was too much water? It wasn't like
Yeah, so
flooding areas.
yeah, so in the southeastern United States, that's an area of the country that already gets a good amount of rainfall every year. I lived in Texas, in eastern Texas, which is kind of on the western border of kind of those types of forests that are found throughout the southeastern United States. And we always got a lot of rain in the early spring, January, February. And that was when amphibians were in kind of like their prime breeding season. And so if you're in a place where you already get an adequate amount of water, getting more water leads to things like flooding. And so that temporary pool that was near a river is now no longer a temporary pool, it's now part of the river floodplain. And so your eggs are being washed out of that temporary pool, fish are possibly getting into that temporary pool, et cetera, because actually the area has gotten too much rainfall. And so they talk about this in the conclusions. They made a general statement. More water tended to be beneficial in areas that were dry, whereas more water tended to be negative in places that already have adequate supplies of water. And that general finding, I think, is based on these more specific findings that they are talking about here.
Okay, so does anyone want to elaborate on what they meant by sensitivity when looking at amphibians?
Yeah, so they said that sensitivity was the expected rate of change for the local species richness of the individual sites with respect to changes in the climatic variables.
So an example of this would be, okay, so temperature increases 1 degree. What degree of change does that have for a particular species occupancy? So if it increases 1 degree, does the occupancy and persistence go up, or does it go down in response to that 1 degree change in temperature? If soil moisture is twice as moist in a year, does that lead to an increase or decrease in persistence and occupancy? And what is the degree of that increase or decrease? So yeah, that's what they're talking about.
Okay, so they said that the sensitivity, whenever they were looking at it, that it suggests there are strong geographic and climate patterns in how the sensitivity changes due to the climate that's already in the area. So does anyone want to elaborate on, just like we did in the last section, just go through some of what they found on what the different types of sensitivity were in what area?
So one of the results they found was that in like the colder areas, they were more sensitive to changes in winter conditions. And then with like the warmer winters and also the greater snowfalls, they had negative effects, which kind of makes sense with what we were saying earlier, with like the warming winters having a negative effect on them, pulling them out of being able to make them more mobile looking for food, whatever, if they can't be more like stagnant during a typical colder winter.
So as I was reading this, it reminded me of the Buckley and Huey paper when they were doing an analysis at greater latitudinal ranges, you know, from the tropics all the way to the north temperate regions. They found that populations that were more sensitive to warming actually happen to be those parts of the world where it is just consistently warmer. So as I was thinking about this finding, oh, winter conditions affect colder places more than they do warmer places, and it's possibly because cold is the norm there, and so changes in that cold regime, whether it's an increase in cold, which might be reflected in increasing snowfall, or a decreasing in cold reflecting warmer temperatures during the winter, might affect that area more, simply because it's got a suite of species that are adapted to the cold. So it kind of falls in line with the findings of Buckley and Huey from the last paper that we read together. Continue.
And so, in contrast to the cold we were talking about, it says that warmer summer temperatures had a positive effect on richness in almost all of the locations except the mid-continent. And what we talked about in our last section, that amphibians reacted positively to increased breeding water availability and soil moisture. And then does anyone want to say what amphibian they found that actually has a positive effect from the warming of winter? Because there was one that didn't align with all the other ones, and it was actually positively affected rather than negatively like all the other ones.
Wasn't it the tree frog?
Yeah. It doesn't say why. Paul, do you have reasoning on behind why?
I remember reading that, and now I'm having trouble finding it. Where's that
It's
at?
the bottom of page 4 on the right hand side. It says figure 7 right behind it.
Okay. Da 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 da. Winter warming are positive for tree frogs. Winter warming.
I mean, did tree frogs, this is kind of what I was wondering, do tree frogs normally go dormant in the wintertime?
Yeah, sure. Yep. So in this case, I'm kind of limited by my own geographic experience. So in East Texas, which is where I've probably herped the most in my life, recreational herping rather than professional herping, tree frogs are relatively early breeders in the spring, and they can breed as early as January in Texas, for example. And actually, one of the sites that's in this paper is one of the sites that I really herped a lot when I was in undergraduate and in graduate school. I realize I'm making Kelsey very uncomfortable as I say these things. So I can imagine that for them, it being warmer would maybe get them out in the field earlier in an environment where it's also just not a place with really severe winters anyway. But I guess I'm having a little bit of trouble wrapping my head around this because tree frogs, because they're tree frogs, tend to be up off the ground, which means they tend to be more prone to desiccation, which means that a warmer winter, when they do get out earlier, might actually cause them to be under higher water stress. But also during these warmer winters, the time periods that they're out are also periods where it's really rainy in those environments. So I had a little trouble finding a good reason why this might have been the case. I'm just not sure. And they don't, I don't see them providing any explanation either.
Yeah.
Because the next group that they talk about, which are Gyronophilus and Pseudotriton, I believe, they talk about warming on those two things. And then after they're done saying what the effect is, they actually provide an explanation as to why that might be the case. So it says warmer summers, on the other hand, were expected to benefit all salamanders except for Gyronophilus and Pseudotriton, two big-bodied salamanders, but of course they live in streams. So they actually provide an explanation here. What was that explanation?
Okay, and
At the bottom of page 6.
Yeah.
For everybody.
It's that they live in like cold, high oxygenated streams, so they're going to be more sensitive to warming.
Yeah, so warming temperatures are good for everybody but them, but these are a set of species who are adapted to cold montane streams. So their overall conclusion for this section is in the next column over. You know, this suggests that local factors such as topography, hydrology, geomorphology may be the primary predictor of how changes in precipitation moisture affect amphibian communities. For me, when I read this paper, the thing that I got out of it, kind of my big picture idea that I got out of it, is that the responses of amphibians and reptiles, or amphibians in this case, to climate change is going to be very local. What leads to increases in one local area may lead to increases in a different local area simply because, you know, each of these places is different in all of these different ways, and is also populated by all these different species. Which kind of leads into the next section.
Yeah, so what did they actually find out on is climate change the reasoning behind amphibian decline in North America?
They found that it was contributing in some factors where climate change was significant and species had high sensitivity to these changes, but like overall it wasn't the driving force.
Yeah, so once again, climate change is important, but it's only important in certain geographic areas, and it's only important for certain types of organisms among the amphibians that they looked at.
Yeah, and it will depend on how quickly the climate is changing.
Yeah, and they mentioned the montane west and the dry west as places that were particularly sensitive in their analysis. And one of the things we know from climate change is more pronounced in mountainous regions. And as climate change affects the dynamics of the atmosphere and the distribution of rainfall, arid areas are also tend to be prone to feeling the effects of climate change more than moist areas. Although one of the areas that they do talk about as being sensitive is the moist southeastern United States. But in this case, it's a case of once again, getting too much of a good thing rather than too little of a good thing. They mentioned the Mississippi Delta region. So at the end of this paper, when we hear policymakers and politicians and scientists, quite frankly, for that matter, when we hear them talk about climate change, what's kind of the tenor of that conversation? I'm taking over from you now, Rose, because I'm about to ask a set of questions that you probably could not conceive of, and it's
Okay.
fine. I didn't expect you to. When you hear people talk about climate change, what's the tenor of that conversation?
Like that climate change is having like overall negative effects everywhere.
Oh yeah, the tenor of that conversation is generally among conservationists, more liberally oriented people. The sky is falling, the sky is falling, the sky is falling. Climate change is going to destroy us all. And among people who want to just stick their head in the sand, they're like, climate change is a myth, it's not real, it's not happening, there are no negative effects. And these are kind of the two voices that you hear. After reading this paper, my question to you guys is, are those two voices valid? And if they are, why are they valid? And if they're not, why are they not?
I mean, I think that they're both valid, but they're both like on the extreme sides of like their own thinking. And especially after reading the paper and seeing that like the positive effects and the negative effects on the populations, the thinking that we were just talking about that we typically hear about in climate change are definitely more extreme. And so we need more thinking like in the middle, combining both extremes together and seeing the negative and positive effects that it has on especially certain populations of species.
Yeah, so I'm going to rephrase what you just said. Both of those examples that I gave you are kind of black and white sorts of ways of thinking. You know, climate change is this and nothing else, or climate change is this and nothing else. This paper demonstrates something that I think is important for you guys to understand as you leave Williamsville College and go out there into the broader world. Climate change, like so many things in science, the actual facts around the effects of climate change are much more nuanced than what you normally hear in a news report, or what you normally hear out of a politician's mouth, or what you normally hear, quite frankly, out of a lot of scientists' mouths. This paper, to me, represents kind of the complexity and the nuanced approach that one needs to have when thinking about climate change. Climate change isn't all bad for all things in all places. Climate change can be catastrophically bad for some things in some places, and it could actually potentially be an unmitigated good for other things in other places, other species in other places. And it's difficult, I think, to have a conversation in the broader public where you're attempting to communicate these nuanced understandings of what science tells us about this complex issue of climate change. I think people ultimately want the quick and easy answer. They want to know, oh, X does Y. I don't think it's as easy to communicate to people, well, X sometimes does Y, and sometimes it does Z, and sometimes it does Q. And it all depends on where you are and what organisms you're talking about as to whether it does X, Y, or Q. That's a much more difficult message to communicate. But unfortunately for scientists, when we go to communicate messages, we have to communicate the message that is true, the message that the research says is the right answer, whatever that right answer is. And I fear that oftentimes scientists oversimplify what the answer is in order to communicate effectively with the broader public. And sometimes I think that gets us into trouble as scientists and as communicators of science. So I guess what I get out of this and what I want you to take from this is that science can be very nuanced in many cases. There aren't necessarily clear-cut answers. You know, climate change is all bad for all things, you know, all species everywhere. That's a nice clean answer, but chances are the cleanliness of that answer means that that answer is actually wrong. And I hope that as you guys leave here, you've learned something about thinking, and how to think through things that equip you to be nuanced thinkers as you move forward from William Jewell College, rather than being simple-minded thinkers who think, you know, climate change should affect all organisms everywhere in this particular way. So I guess the question I have for you is, what has Jewell as an entity as a whole, what has your training in biology done for you? Has it helped you to think through things in that way, or not really so much over the course of your entire careers here? And you can feel free to answer honestly, because I quite frankly have been responsible for a relatively small part of your education.
I would say for like a different perspective, I think I have learned to take in all sides of an argument a lot more than I used to, and so I think Jewell has helped me with that.
Even among things in science.
Yes.
What about the rest of you? How's your thinking process evolved over time?
Yeah, I would agree with what Kiara said.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think like freshman year, it was easy to just like take everything that we read and scientific articles for what they were, but like the older we've gotten and the like we read more articles now in our classes, and so we definitely get like more arguments from like talking about the same topic, so it's easier to like understand that there's different arguments and different perspectives on things.
Has the act of reading literature helped you at all over the course of your 4 years?
Like for myself, I would definitely say yes. Like I came in as a freshman with no science background at all. And I think it's kind of been like more exponential growth for me, like especially towards these like junior and senior years. Reading more literature has definitely helped me more than like my freshman and sophomore years.
Well, good.
Yeah, I think that reading the literature has made me be able to understand stuff more when I do read an article, but I feel like that's so really only centered around ones that, like, there are definitely some ones that I've read that I still think were way above what we were trying to, the level that we weren't worked up to that. And since we're being honest, I'll specifically say like every single paper Dr. Vora wanted us to read, like right over my head, like was not worth my time. It was because I got nothing from it. It did not help me. It did not make me learn how to read anything better, because it was just like we were not worked up to that information.
It was difficult your first year, wasn't it, when you were asked to read papers for the first time? That's a question.
Yeah, specifically in your class.
Yeah, because it was new. You weren't used to it. You'd never been asked to do anything like that before. And we recognize that back then. Like we know that that's difficult for first years. We see the value in it as faculty, so we want to continue doing that. but we also recognize that that's a challenge in that class. Hopefully the challenge in that class helps you as you go forth into other classes, perhaps Dr. Vora's class not included in that category. But I thought you guys had to read some pretty challenging papers in genetics as well when I've taught that class, the couple of times that I've taught that class in the past. So anyway, this paper, one of the reasons that I chose this paper is that one of the co-authors is a friend of mine, and I think it's a pretty thought-provoking paper. And the other reason that I chose it is that it demonstrates that one has to be thinking at a deeper level, at a more nuanced level, at a more flexible level, if we're actually going to think about these big, complicated issues. And I think this paper embodies that to a certain degree. That said, we are done with the semester. I have one thing that I want to tell you before we leave, and that is you've received emails. Have you received an email asking you to fill out course evaluations for this course?
Yes.
Okay, fill them out. I've already talked to you about course evaluations, I think, in the past. The promotion and tenure committee does read them and does make decisions on promotion and tenure with regards to what you write and how you respond in those things. So respond honestly. For every class that you take, a promotion and tenure committee will be looking at those responses anytime that person comes up for promotion, anytime that person comes up for a periodic review, and they take your comments and your responses seriously, probably far more seriously than you take them. So take them seriously. Your professors read them. Your professors change how they teach as a result of the feedback that you give them on those things. I write more on my slides now than I used to because of comments that I've received about that in the past, et cetera, et cetera. So treat them with the seriousness that the college treats them and fill them out for all your classes. And I realize that this is a time of year when you are achieving survey overload. So please do that. And do you have any questions? The exam is on Thursday at 8 o'clock. Yay, 8 o'clock. It will consist of two parts. One part will be a traditional kind of test that you've taken in here so far. It'll be structured the same way all of your other ones, but it will be focused on the material that we've covered since the last test. I'm working on getting your last test graded and back to you. Probably have them back to you on Monday. And then there will be a online version that will be comprehensive, that basically will form the pre-test, post-test for future iterations of this class. For whatever reason, I've never gotten around to creating a pre-test, post-test for this course, so this is my opportunity to do that. So it'll be two parts. One part will be a Socrative test, which will be multiple choice. One part will be focused on the last material, which will be more like your traditional exams. So you will need to bring either a computer or an iPad to take the Socrative test, but the other one will be taken handwritten in 219. So both of them will be taken in 219, but one part will be handwritten and the other part will be digital. Questions? Communicate with one another as you need camera access. So you could pass the camera between you and me and then other students, but that puts one more middle person in there. On the card that is on there, you can actually go through and view the images. Since I don't have the card in my possession anymore, I can't get them uploaded anywhere. So if you have pictures on the card, while the camera is in your possession, if you would just pull your images off the card for putting into your collection. So it might be actually most efficient for you guys if you, rather than pass the camera between yourselves and me to the next person, if you just communicate with one another and make sure that it gets to where it needs to go. That might be the most efficient way. I think Zach was planning on going into the field tomorrow, so the camera is free. It sounds like Kara has the camera right now, right?
Yeah, I have the camera.
Okay, so if somebody needs the camera, contact Kiara, and Kiara will be in touch with Zach about his needs.
Okay, sounds
And
good.
just don't erase anything on the card because I have a ton of photos of my own on the card. So, all right. Well, thanks for coming, and I will see you next week. And if you have any questions between now and the final, by all means, email me.